There was once a time when the announcement of a new Dishonored would make me incredibly excited. It'd be a day one buy. Unfortunately, we're in a post-Redfall world now though, and Arkane Studios, the developer of both of those titles, they're genuinely at rock bottom. That being said, if there was any game to pull Arkane out of the hole that they've dug themselves, it'd be a new Dishonored. Recently, there was a huge Xbox leak which contained a whole bunch of embarrassing internal Microsoft emails. Specifically, Phil Spencer sucking up to his CEO about how great Xbox were, how they were going to win the gen because there were so many exciting titles coming out, including Redfall. That was something he genuinely said. All that's fine, but the real gem was news about upcoming Bethesda titles. The list mostly contains titles we knew about or had already came out. There are a few sort of less exciting ones, like a Fallout 3 remaster, but there were a couple of genuinely intriguing ones. The first of those was a potential new Dune title, and the second was Dishonored 3, which got me raising my brow as the immersive sim genre. It could really use something special. There hasn't sort of been a whole heap, at least in the AAA space, lately. It was listed as releasing in financial year 2024, and that would place an actual release date between April next year and March 2025. That's still a while away, I suppose, but given it'll probably be made by the Deathloop team, I assume they're the ones creating it, it would make sense. Deathloop released in 2021, so we're probably going to get it 4 or so years later, which should be Christmas 2024, unless it's delayed. And I mean, let's be honest, we take delays as a given, so we could probably push it into 2025. Let's see what happens. Outside of the Xbox leak, what do we actually know? Well, the Dishonored series, story-wise, is actually pretty much done. It was always a bit of a hybrid game where you could play completely as a stealth-driven character, or you could use special powers to have more of an action combat experience. But the issue is, the outsider, the supernatural being responsible for those powers, he's gone. So what are they going to do? Well, if we're honest, this is the video game medium where most franchises are up to their 10th, 11th sequel, so I'm sure there's nothing to worry about. They'll either find some excuse to return things back to the status quo. It could be a prequel. It might be set in a completely different time with completely new characters, a soft reboot perhaps. Nothing is going to get in the way of a new title in the series, if there's money to be made. Something we do need to keep in mind is that Arkane do have two teams. They've got an A team and a B team. There's Austin, they were responsible for Prey and Redfall, and then there's Lyon, who we know as making all those traditional titles like Dishonored 1 and 2, Deathloop, and now potentially Dishonored 3. Now, the team responsible for Prey, I was really liking their work. I think Prey is absolutely incredible. I'll talk about that a bit later as well. But then they've obviously made Redfall, and things have fallen apart. So that studio, they were absolutely up on a high, and then they fell off a cliff. Maybe not sales-wise. Prey has never been that sort of huge title that everyone's gotten around. It's just been known in immersive sim circles, where if you like that genre and you've played that game, you know it is one of the best. It probably beats out BioShock. I really like an older title, System Shock 2. I find Prey to be similar to that, and it was fantastic. Lyon, though, they've been alright. They've been sort of ticking along. Deathloop, not the most incredible game in the world, but it was an immersive sim. It was a pretty good game, and so we can be trusting in them to deliver something decent. And I think Dishonored 3 can hopefully be that. Coming back to Deathloop, because it was the Dishonored Studios' last game, it's actually set in the Dishonored universe. That's something that is interesting as well, and it may be part of why they've been trusted to deliver Dishonored 3. Because Deathloop itself, it had the same kind of structure. It wasn't like Redfall, where they went off in the live service direction. Deathloop had that Dishonored DNA. It just felt a little bit gimmicky, rather than missions, levels that were really well crafted, and you could approach them your own way. Deathloop had some of that, but it really just did feel like that big marketing push. I actually get notifications here on my computer every now and then where Microsoft tell me I can go on Game Pass and play Deathloop, where I can kill 12 or so different people in one day, and it's some really exciting time travel adventure. I don't really care much about that. I'm happy for them to do whatever they want on the story front, but I want that really nice gameplay, that crisp stealth gameplay. Give me that and I'm happy. The Dishonored franchise has had a couple of key people. I'm looking at my screen because I'm going to stuff up one of these names. Raphael Colantonio, I think I got it, and Harvey Smith. Now, Harvey Smith, he goes all the way back to Deus Ex. So he's probably one of those godfathers of the immersive sim genre, if we want to call it that. There are other ones, like Warren Spector, I believe it is. He's gone off the deep end. He was responsible for a game called Underworld Ascendant. If you've ever heard of it or you haven't heard of it, don't look into it. It's a joke and you'll wish you didn't look it up. But Harvey Smith, he's been involved in some really good games. He obviously moved on to the Dishonored series, which he created with Raphael, and they had a lot of success with them. When I think of Looking Glass Studios and all those immersive sim pioneers who built games like Deus Ex, Thief, I do think of the stealth, and that's what I really liked about Dishonored, was being able to take that stealthy approach. I could use some powers to make it more than just sort of crouching, hiding from lights. There were a few things you could kind of do with those powers on the stealth front. So I hope there's going to be more of that. What I wouldn't want is for Dishonored to go into more of an actiony direction. Maybe some people like to take that approach. They like the RPG aspects of being able to take these challenges head on the way that suits. But for me, it's all about the stealth, and I hope Dishonored can deliver that. What's interesting to me is it seems like one of the reasons we ended up with Redfall was because Bethesda just weren't confident in the immersive sim genre. Arkane have always delivered titles that are critically acclaimed. The people who do play them seem to like them, but supposedly not enough people buy them. Prey was a perfect example of that. It was essentially, if you like BioShock, if you're familiar with System Shock 2, an older game, Prey was like a spiritual successor. Unfortunately, it wasn't marketed that way, and that's where I get a bit frustrated with Bethesda, because they complain about the series not selling well, and yet they market it as something it isn't. They market it like it's some sort of FPS, it's some sort of generic action game. They actually did it with Deathloop as well. When that was announced and we got trailers, I had no idea what it really was, and it wasn't until there were actual impressions, pretty close to when it came out, that it was clear that it was that sort of immersive sim game. Even if it's not as good as Dishonored, I appreciated it when it came out, because we don't get a lot of them these days. But coming back to Prey, incredible game. It's one of my absolute favourites. It may even be my favourite Arkane title, and yet it sold extremely poorly. And I do think that Bethesda are to blame. There was obviously that nonsense with the IP where I believe Arkane wanted to call it Typhon. It might have been Typhoon, I can't remember which one it was, but they wanted to name it after something actually in the game. Prey is never brought up in the Prey title. It's just a name that was attached onto it because Bethesda happened to own that IP. It was an old game from 2006 and they slapped it on. That annoyed everyone. People who were fans of the original were not interested because they saw it as a cash grab, and the title's probably not that interesting because it doesn't actually relate to the game. So the short of it is, Bethesda seemed to do a lot of meddling. Is it still going to be the case now? I always find it interesting that Pete Hines is still involved at Bethesda post the Microsoft acquisition. I mean, he's supposedly that marketing PR person, so I'm sure he's got some say in how they're marketing these titles. And if that's the case, he has been absolutely useless because Arkane have been screwed over time and time again. Their games should be selling well. We've seen Baldur's Gate 3, for instance. All these titles with old school roots that do well, it should absolutely be the same with Arkane's games. But they haven't sold well, and I think it's because they are not presented to the general public in a good way. The idea that you can play these titles your own way, there's so much freedom, there's great level design. I think people would be excited if they genuinely gave them a shot. But it doesn't happen, and I think it's because people get confused. They don't really know what these games are. It seems like they don't have an identity when they absolutely do. It's just that it's not told to people in the right way. All that being said, Bethesda obviously said to Arkane, your games aren't selling, now you've got to make Redfall. I thought that was going to be the end of Dishonored, the end of Arkane, and in some ways it has been, because the news of a Redfall type game had actually been doing the rounds years before. There was talk when, again, Raphael, one of the Dishonored creators, when he left, he implied that there was a lot of head honcho meddling, that they weren't able to really make games they wanted anymore. They had to make products. Redfall is absolutely a product. It's a title where you can tell suits. There was influence, upper influence from people who were not game developers, who said, hey, these live service games are selling. Why don't you chuck something in there? I can see that you're talking about doing an immersive sim with vampires. How about you just chuck all that stuff in a generic looter-shooter live service? And that's how we ended up with Redfall. Does it mean they've completely lost it? I hope not. Because for me, the modern-day immersive sims, it was Arkane Studios and it was Eidos Montreal who are responsible for the latest Deus Ex games, Human Revolution, Mankind Divided, which I think are quite good titles as well. I want Arkane to still be there, and I think while Harvey Smith, one of the real pioneers of immersive sims in the 2010s, with Dishonored, that they do have that chance to come back. Hopefully Microsoft can just allow them to do what they want. I know they've been hands-off traditionally, and that people have said they should have got involved. They should have cancelled Redfall or given them the time to absolutely revamp that game into their own style, but it wasn't done. One of the concerns there is that the actual fans of immersive sims within those teams, the actual devs, they all left when they saw what was happening with Redfall. And instead, Arkane were forced to hire developers who had experience with live service titles. This probably left the immersive sim guys, the developers passionate about that genre, they were probably left feeling a bit isolated. So they've all gone, and now you're just left with a team who only likes live service games, and there's not many there who have that experience with the traditional games like Dishonored. They've all gone. This is very common within development studios. You look at Blizzard, for instance. You look at their IPs, there's Warcraft, there's StarCraft, there's so many iconic ones, but the people actually working there, not that many of them were actually around when the classics were made. It ends up being a case where they're alive by name only, they're cashing in based off those IP names, those sort of studio names, brand names, but that's really it. You're buying an empty shell, essentially, and sometimes that's when you do have to look at the devs themselves, follow where they've gone, and maybe look if they're making games a bit more in line with what you've liked in the past, the games that they've made in the past. I really, really hope that's not what's going to happen with Arkane. It seems like maybe that's what's going on, but I really hope that they can deliver something. It may not be that Redfall team anymore. That's okay. Maybe Harvey Smith, maybe that team responsible for Dishonored, Deathloop, maybe that's still going strong, because they haven't really let us down massively. Again, Deathloop, not incredible, but still a pretty good game. It shows that that team is still able to deliver. Here's what I'd be doing if I was Arkane and I was Microsoft. I'd really hone in on the strengths of both developers. So the Arkane team responsible for Dishonored, for Deathloop, and then the other studio which was responsible for Prey, and then of course Redfall. And it might seem with Redfall, it's so bad, what are the strengths there? Just throw them in the garbage. But Harvey Smith is there. Surely he himself, who has been so good with other titles in the past, again, Deus Ex, other games, surely there's still experience there that you would need. What I'd be doing is I'd consolidate. They probably don't need both teams anymore, given that they kind of decimated the team responsible for Redfall, given they went from Prey to Redfall. They went from something amazing to something awful. Surely there's just something rotten there. So take Harvey Smith from that team, get him back behind Dishonored, behind that series, behind the immersive sims that the main Arkane team are creating, and let him really go for it. If there's a bunch of live service developers, I'd maybe just move them on to other studios within Microsoft, or do whatever they need to do. But Arkane, I don't think after Redfall they should have two studios. They need to consolidate and start releasing good games again. If it's going well, then maybe you can start to branch out with a bit more. But Raphael, who was the founder of Arkane, founder of Dishonored, many other titles, he left because he saw the writing on the wall, that the studios were not being managed well, and you couldn't really make what you were passionate about anymore. And something like Dishonored, that cannot be a product where it's being milked for money. There's got to be passion there for it to really work, for there to be good level design, good design decisions going on. There was that video the other day with Tim Kaine, the founder of Fallout, and he talked about that, where developers are getting too passive, they're not taking risks. Dishonored needs risk. It can't be a super safe game. That stealth gameplay, you've got to have those amazing levels. It's got to feel like there's genuine passion about it to work, and Dishonored had that. So I hope things work out. I'm going to be following anything that happens around Dishonored 3, and I'll let you know about it. But thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.